Begin our informational workshop tonight here. On the phone is Mr. Thomas Hennick, who's a public education officer from the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission, and he has a presentation for us.
I guess that's me, huh?
You're up, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to do it, guys. Happy to do it. Obviously, this is a different paradigm, if you will. Usually, I like to come out there and talk to you folks. I've been in that council chambers before, that beautiful room. Maybe someday in the not-too-distant future, we can do it again, but tonight we'll have to make do with the telephone. I hope you're all safe and healthy and avoiding the problems with the pandemic. And let's see what we can do here. The only thing that might be tough is questions. I want you to try to, ask the questions whenever you feel like you have one, and maybe if we need to relay them, if somebody, closer to the microphone or closer to the phone wants to just relay the questions, we'll be happy to try to answer them all, okay? Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, we do these workshops around the state, again, in normal times, to try to help, to try to give you some ideas as to how to work with freedom of information. It's not intended to beat you up or to make you miserable. It's just an attempt to try to give you some tools to work with so that if you ever have an FOI situation, issue, question, you'll be better equipped to handle it. I always tell folks a little bit about me before I start. I'm not an attorney, so these are not legal orders or commands from the FOI Commission. This is merely advice. I do these sessions, as I said, all over the state. In a normal year, I do about 100 of them, from west to east, north to south, and what I tell folks is based on almost 20 years of experience at the FOI Commission, conversations with my colleagues, many of whom are attorneys, watching our commission in action, and some practical experience too. In addition to my FOI work for many years, for 10 years in fact, I was on a board in my town, so I know what some of you folks have to go through. I've been on the other side of that fence too. I was the chairman for the last 5, and then I was another board. More recently, I was a member of the Board of Selectmen for 2 years. So I get what it's like to, have real lives and real jobs, and then run home, wolf down some dinner, and then go to a meeting to try to do something for your community. And when you do that, when you run for office or when you agree to appear, be a member of a board or get appointed to a board, you don't necessarily sign up for freedom of information, but it comes with the territory. The FOI Act is the law in the state of Connecticut. It's a 45-year-old law, and it was enacted back in 1975 at the urging of Ella Grasso. It was one of her first primary, I don't know what the right word, in her campaign plank. It was one of her first initiatives that she really wanted to make sure, because when she was contemplating this run for governor, she was in Congress, and she saw Watergate kind of explode all around her. And Watergate troubled her to the point where she said, we've got to do something in Connecticut to make sure that that doesn't happen here. So the genesis of the FOI Act was Ella Grasso, seeing Watergate, seeing the damage that secret government behind closed doors, clandestine action by boards and commissions could happen, what could happen with that, and she pushed it forward when she was elected in 1975. Folks, the law is called freedom of information, but it's not really about free information. It's about access to 2 basic things: access to public meetings, access to public records. I'll focus most of my time tonight on the meetings provisions, but we'll talk a little bit about records. And I do want you to ask, if you have questions and things that I don't touch on, please feel free to ask. One of the first things, just as an aside, that I tell folks is that it's called freedom of information, and that's something really of a misnomer. As I just said, it's really about free access. But a lot of people, and I bet Betsy, if she's out there, is nodding her head, think that it's something that think it's about free information. They think it's about walking into a council chambers or walking into a town clerk's office or a planning and zoning office and say, we got this freedom of information law in Connecticut, and I have a right to know, and you need to tell me. Well, yes, we do have it, and yes, they have a right to know, but it's not necessarily about answering questions. It's not about folks like you and me when I was in my other role, being the answer person and giving people answers, trying to give them, the people have to do a little bit of the work. Laws created to make sure that government is accessible, but we're not necessarily their answer people. So we answer questions when we can, but at some point you say, no, look, hey, come to the meeting when we're going to discuss that, or go get the records where that information is contained, and that's what the law is designed to do. And just should share with you, working at the Freedom of Information Commission, people see that title and they think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. People call us and write to us all the time asking us for records, thinking that all they have to do is contact us and we'll produce the records. They think that we sit in this massive vault with every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut, and all we have to do is push a button and out it comes. And we have to explain to them that that's not what we do. What the law did was create the FOI Commission to sort of be the tiebreaker, to adjudicate situations where people believe they've been denied access. Now, I work, in public information, but another major component of the FOI Act is when people believe they've been denied the access that they've been granted either for a meeting or for records, they file complaints with the FOI Commission, and the Commission's role is to adjudicate that. No, Norwich, you were correct. That's a record you're allowed to withhold. Don't release it. Or Norwich, you were wrong. That meeting should not have been an executive session. Do it right next time. And that's what our commission is designed to do. But this law can be sometimes difficult to maneuver, to deal with, to the point where parts of it are open to interpretation. So I've seen situations where the FOI Commission makes a decision, says, no, that's what you need to do. The town or the city or the public agency doesn't like that decision and appeals it. And you can appeal an FOI Commission decision all the way to the state Supreme Court. And I've seen, us make a decision, one court says that was wrong, another court says it was right, and back and forth all the way to the Supreme Court. So when you make a decision, you want to have the best, tools, the best information in your hands to say, okay, this is what we should do. But it doesn't always mean that everybody's going to agree and someone could file a complaint. If somebody does file one of those complaints, folks, remember that it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you were wrong. It means that they disagree with your interpretation of the law and they'd like to challenge it. But if you've done, if you've lined the ducks up, as it were, if you've done things the way you should, more often than not, you'll be fine. So like I said, it's about access to meetings and access to records. I don't typically read a lot of definitions when I do these talks, but I'm going to read you the one about a meeting. And again, I stress, if you have questions as we're going forward, please ask them. Just interrupt and ask them. It's hard, obviously I'm not seeing anybody wave hands or anything, so you're not being rude. Just ask the question and we'll try to get it answered. So the definition of a meeting in the Freedom of Information Act. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Folks, what that basically means is that any time you gather to do your work, any time that you're going to have a discussion about things that have to do with board business, it's technically a meeting. And you want to make sure you've done some basic things. You want to make sure that it's noticed, that it's open to the public, and that when the meeting is done, there are minutes created which reflect what happened at the meeting, who was there, hitting all the highlights. So a lot of times I'll get conversations with people. They'll call up and they say, look, Tom, it's budget season. Budget season's coming up, and we just like to have a conversation, an impromptu sort of informal conversation so we can set some parameters before we deal with the budget. Can't we do that without noticing a meeting? Now, I realize that, in the business world or, even in other arenas, that might seem to make a lot of sense, but when you're in the public sector, you can't. Those kinds of conversations, those informal conversations, they're not a good idea. You should do your work in public. People say, well, how about this? How about we form a subcommittee? Subcommittee's not the whole board. That way we don't need to deal with freedom of information. Is that all right? And the answer to that is no as well, folks. The definition of a public agency, which is what this law applies to, has a phrase in it that says, including any committee of or created by. So if you create a subcommittee from your council, you're going to create even a three-member subcommittee. If that is what you do, you form that committee. That committee itself becomes a new public agency and needs to follow the same rules. I get asked a lot about a quorum. Hey, Tom, what if we have a conversation that's not a quorum? Well, up until about a year and a half ago, our advice was always be very careful of that as well. But a year and a half ago, the appellate court issued a ruling that sort of tempered that a little bit, and it basically said it would have to be a formal proceeding of some kind, absent a quorum, for it to be a meeting. And so I always tell folks, at least until by the way, and that decision was appealed. It's in the Supreme Court right now, so stay tuned. But right now, you have a little more leeway when you're absent a quorum. So if it's just a couple of you having a conversation, you might be able to say, look, it wasn't a formal proceeding of any kind, and it's not a meeting. I would still urge you to do as much as you can in public and avoid the questions and avoid the issues of what are they hiding, what are they trying to do without letting the public in. Now, in today's world, as we're dealing here, you're sitting there, your residents, your constituents are not there. The rules that the governor set out back in March in Executive Order 7B, they did loosen the requirements for in-person meetings. They said you could have your meetings virtually, but the key, folks, is if you're going to have a meeting virtually via Zoom or go to meetings or whatever platform you use, you still have to provide real-time access, just as you would to have people come into your room, into the meeting room to listen to the meeting. So make sure that you have a link that lets people in or a phone number for people to call so that if people want to observe your meeting, attend the meeting, they can do that as the meeting's going on. But it's still, this basic concept remains the same, real-time access for anybody who wants to go. Now, the law talks to us about three different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. Regular meeting is a meeting that you have per a schedule that you submit to the clerk by the end of January of every year that says we meet on the first and third Tuesday, we meet on the second and fourth Wednesday, 6 o'clock town hall, 7 o'clock library, whatever that is, that becomes your regular meeting schedule. The special meeting is a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. Now, some people see that word special and they get nervous. They say, we can't do this, we can only do that. You can do anything you want to do at a special meeting. Here's the difference between the two. For both of them, you need to prepare an agenda, and I suspect agenda preparers are on the other end of this line. When you prepare an agenda, you want to make sure that the agenda is as specific as possible. The courts have come down pretty hard on sort of wishy-washy agendas. They want you to tell the people what's going on. The court verbiage is keep the public fairly apprised as to what's going to happen. So your agendas, lay out what's going to happen at the meeting. For both the regular and the special meeting, those agendas need to be available at least 24 hours in advance. They need to be available in your office if your board has one. They also need to be handed into the clerk's office. Now, at a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on that agenda, the law says that you can add things to the agenda. So you're going along, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add this item to the agenda. It's not on there. Somebody makes a motion, it gets seconded. If 2/3 of you vote to add it, you can add it to the agenda. At a special meeting, you can't add anything to the agenda. That's the fundamental difference. So when you prepare an agenda, I don't know about you folks, when I prepare an agenda, you use things like other business, old business, new business. That's not the most specific item. That's not the best item to have, but at least at a regular meeting, it's acceptable. You can say, is there any other business? Is there any old business? Someone can make a motion, yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add that. It's not on the agenda. You make a motion, you add it. But at a special meeting, since you can't add anything, an item such as old business, new business, other business, with nothing underneath it, with no specificity, you might as well take it off because you can't add it. It's got to be specific at a special meeting. You can only talk about what's on the notice of that and the agenda of that meeting. So other than that, though, if it's on there, you can talk about anything. Some people say, oh, we can't do that. We can't talk about the old minutes. You can do anything you want at a special meeting, just as long as it's on the agenda. Now, the third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting, is a meeting that I really discourage boards and commissions from using. An emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. It's a meeting that you have in an emergency situation. The problem is that what you and I might think constitutes an emergency doesn't necessarily rise to that level in the eyes of the law. The law is structured to set that bar really high because it wants us to meet as boards and commissions in public. All too often we get situations where people say, "Oh, gee, I forgot to put the agenda in and we have to meet tonight, so I'm putting it in this morning. Is that okay? Can we do that?" And the answer is no, because it's not the 24 hours that we talked about. But I'll say, well, wait 24 hours. They say, no, it's too important if we're going to call it an emergency. And I'm here to tell you that oops, I forgot is not an emergency that's acceptable in the eyes of the law. In our non-legal minds, it might feel that way, but the law doesn't allow that. The law says you must meet the standards. A lot of times people say, well, what constitutes an emergency? It's not all that clearly defined, to be honest with you, but I always tell people to keep people safe, to keep people out of harm's way, to make sure that things are run properly. I had a situation a year or so ago down in Stonington, and there was an old factory that was sitting on near a riverbank, and we got a couple of bad storms, one right after the other, and it looked like the building was about to crumble and fall into the river, and that would have been a disaster. It would have polluted the river. It would have been horrible, and so they had you just can't wait for it to happen. So that morning, when they first realized what was going on, they called everybody together. They had an emergency meeting, and they, what roads to block off, where to put up booms so that how to collect the debris as it fell down, how to keep people away from it so that nobody got hurt, those kinds of things. And they couldn't wait 24 hours to that. So that was kind of an example of an emergency meeting. If you ever have one of those situations where you absolutely have to meet, you can't wait 24 hours to do it, you have your meeting, you talk about only the emergency topic, and within 72 hours, you create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it, and make sure those minutes are available in 72 hours. Remember that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. People, wander in from neighboring towns because they're curious. Again, in the non-pandemic world, but even in the pandemic world, people want to link into one of your meetings. They can do it. They don't have to live in town. You can't ask them who they are. What do you want here? What are you doing here? You need to make sure that it's available to everybody. I don't know if you've had this issue. One of the complications of the sort of pandemic world meetings that we've had is something called Zoom bombing, where people who have absolutely no interest in what's going on in your board or your town or your committee decided they're going to have some fun, ill-mannered fun, I might add, and they link into your meetings while they're going on, and they start, squawking. Some of them have gotten downright nasty. They've been racial epithets, people trying to disrupt meetings and things like that. And that obviously flies in the face of what the law is all about. If you ever have situations like that, we're pretty confident that the law would say, look, you have to do what you have to do. And if you exclude people like that so that you can run an orderly meeting, we don't think there'd be any real violation of the FOI Act. So if you've ever had any of those, if you deal with any of those, you have, I think, a little bit of control, because the law also says that you can run an orderly meeting. So we're talking about, the meetings. The law also says that you can, anybody can audio or videotape one of your meetings. And again, that's not all that big a problem now. This was written into the law 45 years ago in 1975. But my one piece of advice is always remember that people can record your meetings, because we all have, our little phones or everything's in our pocket where we could just turn on a recording, and nothing in this law requires the person to tell you that they're recording the meeting. That's personally one of the parts of the law that I'm not crazy about. I wish that people did have to tell you they were recording, but they don't. So when you're at one of your board meetings, when you're discussing items and things like that, just always sort of have in the back of your mind, gee, somebody could be recording this. I want to be real careful the way I approach this subject. Another thing about this law that people don't realize is that it doesn't give people the right to speak, the right to participate in a meeting. I get calls all the time from folks who say, gee, they wouldn't let me talk. I wanted to talk, I couldn't talk. Or they wouldn't let me talk about the topic I wanted to talk about. It doesn't matter. Public speaking is in your hands, is in the board's hands. So you can control it any way you want. You can say, we're going to limit people to 3 minutes tonight. Or we're going to say, we're going to limit it to this topic tonight. We're going to say, hey, look, we've heard about this topic 1,000 times. We're not going to hear from anybody tonight. Now, I'm not advocating any of those things, but I'm using them as examples of things that you are allowed to do. You have a situation where you're in control. It's your meeting. And if you want to hear from people, you can, but nothing in the FOI Act requires you to do that. So the level to which you do it, how long you let it go, those are all things that are in your control. Now, we're talking about making sure that your meetings are open to the public, that anybody can come, and all of those things. There are paths, of course, that boards and commissions can use to exclude the public, and I suspect many of you, all of you probably are familiar with the executive session. Remember that an executive session is not something that sits on an island by itself. An executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It is not something that you just sort of slink into. Even if you have a meeting agenda with only one item on it, and the one item is an executive session item, you still need to convene in public. You need to vote to go into that executive session, naming one of the 5 specific reasons for that executive session. You go into executive session, you have whatever conversation you're going to have. When the conversation ends, and you can stay in as long as you want, have your discussion. When the discussion is over, you come out of executive session and take any action you. Remember that an executive session must be, voted on. You have to go into executive session, and you come out to vote. All your votes need to be recorded. All your votes need to be in public, and people need to know precisely who votes for what or for whom. So, the 5 reasons for executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction, and the 5th one is something of a catch-all. It allows for a board to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. Now, back to the top, a personnel executive session. If you have a personnel matter that you're going to discuss in executive session, there's a couple things to remember. First of all, just saying executive session personnel on your agenda, in your motion, is not acceptable. The commission, the FOI commission, and the courts have come down pretty hard on that. You need to say more than executive session personnel. Executive session plan, discussion of the performance of a public works employee, discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the possible appointment of a member to the board. You don't necessarily have to name the individual, but you must give us more than personnel. Us being the people of Connecticut need to have more than just personnel. Then you need to remember that you're obligated to tell the individual that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. The person needs to be given notice in advance. The person then has the right to come forward and say to you, no, wait a minute. I do not want an executive session. I want that discussion to be held in public. I want everybody to hear what's being said about me. And if the person does that, if the person insists on that open discussion of his or her performance or appointment or whatever, then you can't go into executive session. The person has the absolute right to demand that the discussion be in public. Where people get hung up, however, is that they do not have the right to say, no, I don't want that to be done in public. I want it in executive session, but you're talking about me. I demand to be in the executive session with you. The person can actually demand all he or she wants, but nothing requires that. The only people that must be in executive session are the members of the board. Those are the only people who have an absolute right to be in there. Now, a board can invite in whomever it wants to give evidence, to give testimony, to use somebody's expertise. Board can clearly do that, but it's not a requirement. So when the individual who's part of the personnel executive session waives the right to an open airing, whether or not he or she goes in is up to the board. It's not up to the person. The person does not have the right to demand to be in the session. The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. There's a lawsuit. There's a CHRO complaint, an FOI complaint, and the board wants to talk about its strategy, how it's going to handle it, how it's going to deal with it. You can go into executive session, have that conversation under the pending claims reason for executive session. You can also, it's a little broader in that you can discuss taking legal action. Let's suppose the city of Norwich is going to think about taking action against somebody who owes the city a lot of money. Well, you wouldn't have to have that discussion in public and tip your hand. You could have that conversation behind closed doors. The executive session for security matters. Folks, that's one that didn't used to come up a whole lot, but ever since Sandy Hook happened in 2012, it's become more prevalent, especially with school boards. School boards talk about adding resource officers, add about bulletproof glass, things like that, stuff that I suspect many of us never had to deal with or think about when we were going to school, but it's a reality today. So the idea would be, they could talk about it behind closed doors on the off chance that the very people they're trying to keep out of the building are sitting in the audience listening to the plans that they're making on how to keep them out. The executive session for a real estate transaction. The city needs to build a new police station. The city needs to build a new firehouse or is going to lease some property to expand town hall, something like that. You could have those kinds of discussions, those kind of negotiations behind closed doors. You wouldn't have to tip the city's hand by negotiating the public. You could clearly do that behind closed doors and make the best deal you could. The off chance that talking about it in public, oh gee, look, the city's involved, let's jack up our price, or let's try to do something to benefit us because the city has all that extra money. But that you get the idea. And that last reason for executive session, the one where you can talk about documents or a document that are exempt from disclosure, that has sort of a wide net because there's so many different documents that could conceivably be exempt. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's suppose you're a board that puts out a bid package or some RFPs. There's an exemption in the FOI Act that allows you to withhold content of bids or RFPs until you've actually signed the contract. That's 1-210B24 if you wanted to take a look at that. So let's suppose you put out a bid package and you want to look at them as a board. The bids come in, you want to look at them, you take them over, you look through them. You can do that in executive session if you're not sharing those bids with the rest of the world. You haven't shared them with anybody yet. So you have that, you look at them, and then after you've looked them over, you would come out to vote. Once you accepted the bid, then the package everything becomes public. That exemption is what is called temporal. It's an exemption that lasts until you've actually signed the contract. Another example on that one would be, let's suppose you ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You are the client in that instance, so the document is covered by the attorney-client privilege. You wouldn't want to share it with anybody, and so you would go into executive session and talk about the advice, the written advice that your attorney has given you. Again, you're not going to reveal that to the rest of the world, so you could have that conversation behind closed doors. Those are just a couple examples of how the executive session for documents would be in play. Now, I'll just pause there for a second. Sometimes people have questions about executive session. Does anybody have any? Or if I don't hear any, I'll go forward.
Members, any questions at this time? Yes, Alderman DeLucia would like to speak with you.
Just where would collective bargaining and contract negotiations in process that are all confidential while they're ongoing, where would that fall?
What would this be collective bargaining?
Yes.
Yeah, well, collective bargaining, that leads me to my next area. Collective bargaining negotiations, collective bargaining strategy sessions fall under a category of things that leave us scratching our heads as lay people. The legislature said you can take those out of the definition of a meeting, basically. So when you have those kinds of conversations, they're not even though they sure feel like them. If you've ever done any collective bargaining, and I know I have, and I suspect many of you have as well, the law says that collective bargaining conversations are not meetings, so they're not covered by all that we've been talking about so far. Got it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, because where I was going to go next is when, I read you the definition of a meeting.
Excuse me, sir? Yes, President Pro Tem Mark Bettencourt also has a question.
Just more specifically, I think we're talking about, say you were in the middle of negotiations and the council itself wants to go into executive session to discuss a collective bargaining issue.
You want to talk with the bargaining unit?
No, we're discussing strategy regarding negotiations.
Right. And again, if it's collective bargaining, it's not a meeting. So you would do that before the meeting or after the meeting with the public excluded. It's funky because it seems like it would be a logical place to allow boards to go into executive session, but the law says you don't even need to notice it or vote to go into executive session. If it's collective bargaining strategy, you can do it anywhere, anytime. You could drive over to the casino if you wanted and do it in one of the restaurants or something like that.
We'll remember that.
Yeah, that's a plan. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you, sir.
And where I'll draw your attention is when you look at the definition of a meeting, which I read you when we started talking about this, the next sentence, it's in the same 1-200 number 2, says meeting does not include. And the biggie there's two of them. It's collective bargaining, strategy negotiations with respect to collective bargaining, and executive level search committees. So, when your town manager retires and you want to look for a new town manager, you would form an executive level search committee. And again, that committee could be whomever you want it to be, but that group could operate outside of freedom of information, meaning not noticed, not open, no minutes.
So
Collective search committees all fall into that category. Yeah.
all right, so if you were, say, wanted, because we're here together today, wanted to discuss something in ourselves regarding collective bargaining, would it be then appropriate, instead of having an executive session, to just go into recess and, momentarily and go discuss it?
That's correct. That's correct. And it confuses people, including myself, because, you would think the natural order of things would be an executive session, but it's not. You would have your recess, you'd have your collective bargaining discussion. That's why I always recommend that, especially, again, in the days when we're having open meetings, you sort of politely tell people, okay, it's time for you to leave now. We're going to have a collective bargaining session and a strategy session, and it's not a meeting under FOI, so we're done with the formal part of our evening. But if you have to do it in the middle of a meeting, that's what you would do. You would recess, have your strategy session, and then come back in.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so some of the other things in that, things that are not a meeting that sure seem like a meeting, but the legislature says you don't have to treat them like a meeting. Chants or social gatherings. And the wording there is interesting too. Neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. And I get a kick out of that. Now, let's suppose you guys all want to go out to dinner, after the meeting is over. What else are you going to talk about? The law says you can't talk. So what are you going to talk about? The weather for 3 hours or something like that, or the World Series? Well, the reality is that those conversations are going to take place, and you want to nobody should be so naive to think that they don't. But what you want to do is understand that you want to avoid the deep, deliberative conversations that you should be having in the public arena. You want to have a discussion about an agenda. You want to have a sort of a rehash of something that just happened. But don't have a deep argument, debate, over dinner or at a bar or, even at the coffee shop that you should be having in public, because I guarantee you the one time that you do, that you go too far, The wrong person is going to be sitting in the next booth and file a complaint that you've had an illegal meeting. One of the pet phrases that I use is avoid setting the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. You know what I mean? Stay away from those conversations in a private arena when you should be having them in public. And sort of hand in hand with that is the idea that you want to make sure that you understand that meetings can take place in person or by means of electronic equipment. And electronic equipment today, it was originally written in there for the telephone, but we talk about email, we talk about text, we talk about, Facebook and things like that. Doesn't mean you have to abandon those because you're on a board, but understand that if you start having a conversation with a fellow board member, say via email, that you could be setting yourself up to be accused of having an improper meeting. You send something out to all your board members and say, this is what I think we ought to do about this, and somebody writes back and says, I think that's stupid, and somebody else writes back and says, no, that's a great idea, and you start arguing or debating or discussing via email. Well, you could, in theory, be having a meeting that should be held in the public sector. And people say, well, who's going to find out? You need to remember that when you write emails like that as members of the council, you're creating public records that, in theory, somebody might want to ask for and see. So you want to just be, real careful the extent to which you communicate with each other electronically, with the understanding that could be deemed a meeting that shouldn't be held either. So, again, we're stressing you do as much as you can in public, and the FOI Act will not be a burden for you. The last thing that we should talk about with meetings, before I talk just for a couple minutes about records, are minutes. And minutes are not meant to be a recreation of every word that everybody says at a meeting. I like to say they're not the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word. They are not verbatim transcripts. Technically, the only requirement for meeting minutes is a record of the votes. Who votes for what or for whom? It should be very clear, who voted yes and who voted no when you pick up the minutes. But the more you put in there as far as, who said this and who said that, you're running the risk of I didn't say that, I didn't mean that, we have to change that. You're setting yourself up for, constant conversations about little things in minutes that you really don't need to worry about. I always recommend a nice, crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happened. You're obviously creating Norwich's historical record. You want more than just the votes in there, but you want to make sure that you've got some things in there that are specific to what was being discussed, so that people can pick up those minutes in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of years, and say, okay, I get what they were saying. I understand what was behind this, and move on. But the verbatim transcripts get you into trouble every time. And another thing that's important is that the more concise they are, the faster they are can be done, because the minutes need to be available to the general public in 7 days. And the law is pretty specific about that as well. So sort of put that on file as well, and make sure that, whoever does the minutes for you gets them in 7 days. Are there any issues that I didn't touch on when we talk about meetings? I want to just give you a couple minutes about the records provisions, if I can.
Please continue.
Okay, so just, again, we could spend hours on the public records provisions, but I just want to give you a little bit of an overview, take a couple minutes to talk about it. The FOI Act is about access to meetings and access to records. And when we talk about records, the thing to remember is that the definition is very broad. And it basically says that any record held by any public agency, or taken in by any public agency, or created by any public agency is defined in theory as a public record. And I can walk in and ask to see that record, or I can ask to get a copy of it. And so on top of those definitions, there are multiple exemptions and exceptions. I referred to a couple of them when we talked about the executive session for records that might be exempt. But when you start sort of assuming in advance that a record isn't going to be available, I don't have to worry about that, or I don't need to do that, you're asking for trouble, because the law wants as many records as possible to be available to the public. And often folks get possessive. They say they're mine, or they're council records, or they're planning and zoning records, or they're land use records, and you can't have them. And, well, that doesn't work. You have to look at what the content of the records are. Does the content fit an exemption? Is that a reason not to give it out? People get selective, too. Now, I know I've been to Norwich. I've talked to your folks. I was just out there last month talking to your police department. Very nice people. You don't have any difficult people in Norwich, right? So you don't have to worry about the difficult people. I'm not hearing any laughter, so maybe I've struck a nerve. But even if the difficult person comes in and wants to see a record or wants a copy of the record, you have to remember that it's not about who's doing the asking or what they're going to do with it or how they're going to use it. It's about the record. It's a public record on its face, and it either fits an exemption and gets withheld or it's released. Remember, folks, that if people ask you for a record, it's got to exist. There's no such thing as a prospective record request. Well, this big thing is coming up in planning and zoning or coming before the council. Anytime you get a piece of paper or email or something about that, I want to see it. It's only about records that exist. To that end, you're not required to create a record that doesn't exist. And you're not required to do research for people. A lot of times people will want you to do their work for them. If we're talking about public records, it's records that exist, records that people have in their possession, not things that, you might have to create for them. You don't have to do research for them. And when we're talking about records, we're talking about all records. I made reference to to emails. When you're emailing each other about, board business, to be very careful, because a lot of times people will say to me, gee, Tom, I was working at home, especially today, so many of us are working remotely. I was working at home, or I was using my own laptop or my own desktop or my own phone. That doesn't count, does it? Well, yeah, it does. If you create something in the conduct of Norwich's business, it's a public record, and people have a right to see it or get a copy of it if it doesn't fall under one of those exemptions. The different exemptions and exceptions, as I said, we could spend hours on. If there's a federal law or state statute that says this is a record that doesn't get released, that would override just about anything in the Freedom of Information Act, and you wouldn't give it out. On top of those, and again, one of the problems with those is that there's no list anywhere. No list that says, here are all the records that state statute says you can't give out. You have to kind of find those. We know about some of them. If you're in law enforcement, if I say nollie, you know what that is. You know that if you've been arrested after 13 months, if the case has been nollied, the record is destroyed. If you're in education, if I say FERPA, you know what that is. There's the Family Educational Right to Privacy Act. It's a federal statute that says education institutions don't give out records that personally identify students. So for those, there's an exclusion in the FOI Act that says you don't give out the home address of certain individuals on certain records. Police officers, judges, correction officers can have their addresses redacted if somebody asks for a record with their address on it, their home address. So those are mandatory. Those are exceptions and exclusions. You don't give those out. Then there are the exemptions. Those are in the FOI Act. There's 28 of them in Section 1-210. And 1-210 talks about just a wide scope of records. The difference between those and the records that we just talked about is that those are what are called permissive. And some of the categories in the permissive exemptions, there's an exemption for things in personnel records if they're invasion of privacy. The law enforcement exemptions are in Section 1-210. There's an exemption for documents created as part of strategy for pending claims and pending litigation, strategy when it comes to collective bargaining, records that if released would be a safety risk. You're getting the idea. There's a wide category, and again, there's 28 of them. And what I tell people when they look at records and when we're involved in the public, that what they would want to do is say, okay, have some idea of what some of those exemptions and exceptions were, so that they, if somebody asked them for access to a record, they would have to give it up. I suspect that those of you on council have your staff. I know Betsy is good. I know John's good with records, what is, what isn't. And if you get requests for records, lean on them a little bit. Sorry, guys. and they can help guide you through it. But another thing to remember is that if you get a request for records as a public official, the law requires you to respond in 4 business days. Now, respond doesn't necessarily mean produce the records, but you have to at least acknowledge the request. Dear sir, dear madam, we're in receipt of your request. We're looking into it. We'll find the records. We'll have the legal staff, review it, whatever it might be. But always get a response out within four business days, because the law says that if you don't, you've actually denied access to the records, and the person can file one of those complaints with the FOI Commission. Just as I wrap up, my part, and then hope that if you have any questions, you'll ask them. We'll share a little story with you. A couple months ago, a woman called me. She says, "Hi, my name is Sean." I said, "Hi, Sean, how are you?" She says, "Oh, I'm very good. I'm calling you from Georgia." I sort of scratched my head and I said, "Georgia? Who the hell's calling Connecticut FOI from Georgia?" She says, "Well, my husband is an out-of-state contractor, and he did a job in Connecticut last summer." Oh, okay, so now I get it. And she says, "And I think he had an affair with a state worker." Why is she calling me? It wasn't me, right? So I said, she says, "Well, I want to know if I can see some of those state workers' emails and texts and things like that." So I stopped and I said, well, if you've got emails that might say something like, "Let's meet at the construction trailer at 6 o'clock, and we can look at the blueprints, and then, after that, ... I said, "Well, yeah, I guess that's a public record." She said, "Good, it'll help me with my divorce." Folks, remember, you created in the conduct of Norwich business, in that guy's case, it was state business. It's a public record, and people can ask for it. People can get it if it doesn't fall under one of those exemptions. Well, what happens if, gee, Tom, I'm working at home. Do they come in and grab my laptop? Well, no. But you would be responsible legally for extracting anything that has to do with Norwich business from that laptop and either printing it out or putting it on a thumb drive or something like that and making it available to anybody who asks for it. So on that note, I will stop and ask if anybody has any questions about records or meetings or anything that I didn't touch on.
Yes, Alderwoman Gould?
Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. I just want to go back to one of the things that you said, if we can,
Sure, absolutely.
about, and I think you used the expression Zoom bombers,
Yep.
or someone who refuses to identify themselves if they want to speak at a meeting, whether it's over the telephone. What happens with a situation like that when you get somebody who's calling into a meeting and they refuse either to identify themselves, or their comments are belligerent or not within the scope of what the meeting is about? How do you handle that? You just hang up on them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that falls into that area of things that we've really been struggling with since March, because the law is pretty clear. You can't ask anybody to identify him or herself to come to a meeting. Now, the first part of what you said, if they refuse to identify themselves, but they're going to come in and behave themselves, I would argue that you'd have to let them come in. I'm not going to I refuse to give you my name. I still want to attend the meeting. I think we'd say you had to let them in. But once they become belligerent or start disrupting the meeting, I would argue, and I think the commission would agree, and I've talked to my superiors about this, that you could shut them out, that you could mute them, that you could kick them out if you had the capability to do that, because the law would not want you to sort of struggle with that to the point that you couldn't get your business done. It's not written anywhere, it's not in statute anywhere, but that's sort of our consensus at FOI, what we think you should do.
Okay, thank you.
Have you had that happen?
I have not, no.
No, but it's not uncommon. Again, since March, it's happened around the state. One of the first questions I took on that was a Board of Education that had somebody call in and they had no idea who it was, and they started slandering the board members and hurling racial epithets at them, and it was really very ugly. And they didn't know what to do. And so they refined it so that they had sort of a call-in system where someone would have to call in to get a password or something like that, and that cut it down. So, you'd have to use your best technology and your best, ability to try to shut some of these people down.
But you don't, you could say, could you please stop with that language? Maybe do you have to warn them? Or if they're just going on a rant with,
Yeah, I think I would use judgment. I think, to give a blanket answer to that, I think might be, not, just sort of not prudent on my part, because I really think it depends on what, what they're saying, how they're saying, it could be the town idiot too. And so you might want to give that person a little more latitude, because that's what he or she does every time they come to a meeting anyway. There is a provision in the FOI Act, again, not related to the pandemic, when you talk about, meeting conduct, and it gives the board some latitude. It can remove people from a meeting, even with FOI. If you look at section 1-232, it talks about if in the event that a meeting is interrupted by a person or a group, and that renders conduct of the meeting impossible, you can have them removed. So I think the same would hold when you're meeting remotely.
thank you.
Sure.
I have,
Anything
I have one question, sir.
Sure.
The status of a non-resident who appears before a border commission in the conduct of their duties, in the FOI, they have the same standing as a resident?
No, it doesn't. And anybody can attend. It doesn't have to be a resident.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, I know you've got another meeting coming up, maybe a longer evening than you'd like. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, folks, and Betsy and John can attest. I spend most of my day at the office answering questions on the phone. When I'm working from home, I answer questions on the phone. Typically, what happens is when I get done with one of these sessions, somebody says, "Oh, I should have asked." Just pick up the phone and call. I will call you back, or send in an email. I'll get you an answer. None of the answers are binding. They're not legal, orders or commands or anything, but we're always happy to try to help. We would rather have you have the questions answered before it becomes a problem, before somebody files a complaint. We'll be happy to try to help.
Thank you very much, sir.
Welcome. Listen, have a great night, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.